Evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Elizabeth Dori Tunstall, who is here with her new book, Decolonizing Design, a Cultural Justice Guidebook. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our ever-growing digital community. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Our spring event season is charging along with many in-person and virtual events. You can see what's coming up on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. After this introduction, I will drop a link in the chat to order Decolonizing Design. Your purchases make this virtual author series possible and now more than ever support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's event will include some time for your questions. If you have a question for Dori at any time during the talk tonight, just go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and we will get through as many as time allows. This event also has closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption live transcript button, also at the bottom of your screen. Finally, as you might have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past couple of years, technical issues might arise. If they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you for your patience and understanding. Dori Tunstall is a design anthropologist, public intellectual, and design advocate. Her work is focused on the nexus of critical theory, culture, and design. She serves as the Dean of Design at Ontario College of Art and Design, OCAD University, where she is the first Black and first Black female dean of a faculty of design. Prior to coming to OCAD, she taught at Swinburne University in Australia and the University of Illinois at Chicago. In addition, she organized the U.S. National Design Policy Initiative and served as Director of Design for Democracy. What is good design? Is it beautiful? Is it functional? Is it accessible? Sure, of course. But perhaps a better question would be, is it possible that over the years, so-called good design, architecture and technology have been tools of exclusion and oppression? In her insightful new book, Decolonizing Design, a Cultural Justice Guidebook, Dori delves into modernist design and explores how design theory can better reflect the lived experiences of Indigenous, Black, and people of color communities. It asks us to imagine the current and future possibilities for design. The Boston Globe writes, she reveals the lie beneath the promise that technology will improve lives and the ways in which white supremacy is embedded in so much of our built world, as well as the impact of that embedment. And she gives practical, hands-on tips for how to undo it. Tunstall is clear-eyed in her account of the difficulty of the work and the wounds it might open in the effort to heal and connect. So now I'm extremely pleased to turn things over to tonight's speaker. The digital podium is yours, Dori.
Thank you. Let me begin with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge the ancestral territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands in which I live and work here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I also acknowledge that the Harvard Bookstore is located on the traditional ancestral territories of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge, and pay respects to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. So welcome and thank you for visiting me virtually on behalf of the Harvard Bookstore to discuss my new book by MIT Press, Decolonizing Design, a Cultural Justice Guidebook. As it has just come out yesterday, I'm assuming that you have not read it. So I'll kind of organize this as a bit of a chat, talk a little bit about why I wrote the book and for whom I wrote it. I will walk you through some of the structures of the book, and then I'll read some choice passages from some of the chapters just as a bit of a provocation, hopefully chat a bit more, but hoping to spend a lot of time in dialogue with you. So please ask a bunch of questions, because it's my favorite way to kind of interact and engage with some of the topics and the themes that I'm going to bring up. So Decolonizing Design, a Cultural Justice Guidebook. What is decolonizing design is probably the first theme to address, and it really has to do with first, as I engaged in sort of the land acknowledgement, it's about recognizing the relationship to the land and the relationship to the Indigenous peoples, specifically to the land. And the processes of rematriation that is necessary to heal the relationships that has been broken between Indigenous people and their lands. And so within that, that's the decolonizing part. And I'll talk about why that is actually different and distinct from diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Design. So design that I'm talking about here is not just the design of objects, interactions, communications, but that wider sense of design in terms of how we make plans for and possibilities for how we want to engage with each other, with the land in the present, but also how we want to, again, design and plan for the future. And I call it a cultural justice guidebook because it's not just the thematics I'm trying to explore is not just about society, but about culture and what it means to create a platform by which Indigenous, Black, and other POC cultures stand side by side with European and European-derived cultures, especially as it relates to design. So I wrote this book kind of coming out of the 2020, the summer of reckoning, when the rest of the world came to understand that the levels of state violence against Black, Indigenous, and other racialized folks, that it was heavy, it was unjust, and because of the pandemic and the way in which it stopped the world enough in which white folks, wealthy folks, ever so busy folks could not look away from the harms that come from state violence, that they had to reckon with their positionality in relationship to not just Black and other racialized and Indigenous communities, but they also had to reckon with the institutions and the way in which the institutions are not serving justice. So that summer, OCAD University had just completed our Black cluster hire, which brought in 5 full-time Black faculty members for the first time in the faculty design in over 144 years. And so at this time, the announcement of the outcomes of the Black cluster hire came out at the same time in which there was a resurgence in Black Lives Matter. And so those two things became conflated in a way that helped us to be able to tell a story of, yes, there is institutional injustice, yes, but there is a way in which as institutions and firms that you can understand the harms that you have done, understand the neglect of Black communities, and begin to take steps to make amends. So my email was abuzz with 2 groups of people. Black and other racialized folks who were getting calls to solve the problem of racism in their organizations. And then the second group were white, mostly liberal design leaders asking me what it is that they can do to bring diversity, equity, inclusion, and sometimes even decolonization into their organizations. So when people ask me for whom I wrote the book, it's for these 2 groups. The thing that puts them in commonality with one another is that they are all interested in how the way in which they structure the histories and the institutions and the practices of design. How can we do so in a way that, again, brings cultural justice to communities and organizations that have been structurally excluded, that have been discriminated against, and that have been harmed by the way in which we talk about and think about design. So when Victoria Headley of MIT Press asked me, do I want to write a book? My normal response would have been saying no, because it's a full-time job to be the Dean of Design at OCAD University. But I was so overwhelmed by the request to meet and to share that I agreed to take the time during that summer to begin to write out what I realized to have been the sort of 20 years of my thinking around decolonizing design, and particularly the work of decolonizing design at OCAD University. So in terms of the structure of the book, it's organized into an introduction and 5 chapters, and all of them seek to answer the question of what does it mean to decolonize design? And as a person, I prefer to focus on meaning as opposed to definition, because meaning leaves open many possibilities. One thing might mean this to me, but it might mean something completely different to you. So when you focus on meaning, you focus in a way that embraces other possibilities of what these things can mean to other people. And that's part of what becomes a lesson in humility. So I'm not providing all the answers. What I'm providing is a sense of what decolonizing design has meant to me, and a hope in many ways that you will find resonance in what it has meant to me for you. So each chapter focuses on decolonizing design might mean in chapter 1, putting Indigenous first. And this was really about me digging deep into my positionality vis-a-vis Indigenous nations, peoples, and communities, because as I said before, decolonization is about the rematriation of Indigenous relationships to their lands, which have been stolen from them. Chapter 2 is, again, decolonizing design might mean dismantling the tech bias in the European modernist project. So this is the myth, one of the 2 myth-busting chapters, where I look at the notion of what we call modern design and the way in which these ideals of like better living through technology has actually been quite harmful for many communities. In chapter 3, I look at the dismantling the racist bias in the European modernist project. So again, talking about the way in which white supremacy is an underlying set of principles around which our modernist design project, the European modernist design project is fueled, right? In chapter 4, I talk about making amends through more than diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is about speaking to the way in which diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, first of all, is not the same as decolonization. And then I talk about some of the pitfalls of DEI initiatives and how they can be avoided, and how through some of the work that's been done at OCAD University, we've been able to avoid some of those pitfalls. And the 5th chapter is about reprioritizing existing resources to decolonize. So this is the important chapter. So everyone's like, well, where are you going to find the funding for this? And so it talks about the way in which the business case for cultural justice is one in which is not one of necessarily needing new resources, but again, taking the limited resources that exist and making different decisions around them, making decisions and prioritizing the actions and activities that will contribute to decolonization. So that's a little bit of the structure of the book. Looking again in multi-dimensional ways at what decolonizing design might mean, again, with the hope that these might resonate or echo something for all of you. So now we'll do, I want to do a reading of a bit of a chapter, because I think one of the things that was really important in creating this book was it needed to accomplish 3 things for me. It needed to be deeply connected with my lived experiences. So there's a lot of narrative, like each chapter is started by a narrative scene. Again, I'm very much into critical theory, so there's a lot of theory, but interwoven with a lot of practicality. So how the praxis in many ways of decolonizing design needs to weave in and out together, in the sense of that you have these ideals, how are they made manifest in reality? Because it's my deep belief that the value of ideas and the value of ideals that seek social cultural justice is not just in terms of the liberation it brings in terms of thinking, the freeing of the mind, but it's the way in which it shapes actions that impact other people. And so it was very important that the book be grounded in my lived experiences, again, engage with theory, but very, very practical in terms of helping people see what it is that they can do to change the world, right? To make it a better, more just and equitable and decolonized place. So I'm going to read from chapter 3, which is Decolonizing Design Means Dismantling the Racist Bias in the European Modernist Project. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to read just a few paragraphs or so from it, and then kind of walk you through a little bit of what's happening in that particular chapter. That will begin. My Ethiopian partner and I wanted to move from the Chicago neighborhood of Edgewater to the next neighborhood north, Rogers Park, so that he could be closer to Northwestern University. I had called to see about an apartment. This was our 4th appointment to view an apartment, so we had learned that with my English name, Elizabeth Tunstall, and my untraceable continental accent, we would have no problem getting an appointment. This was different from when we used Muhammad's name and he called to make the appointments. We arrived at the apartment on time. A young white woman in her late 30s opened the door with a toddler on her hip. Her eyes widened in surprise to see that we were Black. I announced my name, that we had talked on the phone earlier, and that I was here to see the apartment. With obvious hesitation, she led us into the flat. Shifting the toddler to her underhip, she then began the ante-sale. You know, we don't like loud parties, she said, a statement disconnected from any topic of discussion. That's fine, neither do we, Muhammad replied, without missing a beat. Also, we don't allow drugs, smoking, or anything, she said. That's fine, we don't do drugs, drink, or smoke, I replied. Muhammad and I side-eyed each other. We really like it quiet here, she announced. Yes, so do we, I answered. Muhammad here is a PhD student at Northwestern, so he studies a lot, and I'm a professor at UIC. 1, 2, 3. We waited for the shift. Oh, Northwestern, you are a professor? Oh, then you would love it here. It's very quiet. It gets great sun, and my husband and I live upstairs, she gushed, putting the toddler down and handing us the application form. I gave a tight smile and turned to Muhammad. I think we've seen enough, yes? He nodded. We walked to the door. Let me know if you have any questions about the application, she called out to us, standing in the doorway. We gave her both tight smiles and walked down to the sidewalk. When we were out of earshot, I turned to Muhammad and sputtered in pure rage, that bitch. I hate racist Chicago. The modern city and joining universal humankind. The modern city of Chicago is also the most racially segregated in North America. It has a segregation dissimilarity index of 80, with 100 being absolute segregation, and this is by design. According to urban historian, Chicago invented modern segregation. In an interview with Chicago Magazine, historian Elaine Lewinick is quoted as stating, quote, Chicago real estate industry was a national leader in the 1900s. The first texts of real estate appraisal were written by Chicagoans. The first real estate lobby, which was one of the most powerful lobbies in America, were formed in Chicago. These ideals that we need single race, single use spaces in order to have our property values go up, these are actually new ideals that can be traced back to Chicago in the 1910s. Unquote. Chicago shows that the second theme of the modernist design project is a lie. The promise that if you give up your national and ethnic identities, you will join universal humankind. In the eyes of the potential landlord, it was only my partners and my advanced education that allowed her to see us as potentially humans. Before that, we were a cluster of Black stereotypes for her, threatening to bring loudness, drugs, and drama into her home. The promise of giving up national and ethnic identities to join universal humankind was only open to white Europeans. In this chapter, I will demonstrate how this was a failed project in Europe and how it succeeded in North America and places like Australia only because of white supremacy. So I'll stop reading directly and I'll kind of talk about a little bit of what's happening in that chapter. And I'm going to take off this earring because it keeps it keeps reflecting in my eyes. So in the chapter, I talk about the fact that in Europe, this notion of, again, dropping your ethnic and national boundary identities to join this universal humankind was really a utopian idea. In the history of Europe, there has and continues to be extreme conflict between different nations. So you have the French hating the English and the Germans hating the Italians. And so at the times in which this ideal of like a universal humankind among Europeans came through, it was really quite, again, universal and quite revolutionary. And this found its way into this notion of what we talk about Bauhaus design. And people have to remember that the sort of Bauhaus period came after World War I. So that what they were seeking to, the design they were seeking to create in many ways was one of a universal man, because they used the term man there. But when they were thinking of it, they were thinking of the working class man, and particularly a working class man who had been traumatized by the First World War in body and spirit. And so they were wanting to create spaces and places of healing and economy of movement so that this, again, universal man depicted as, again, a white working class man could find their way back into society, find their way back into a harmonious society. But again, it's a thing where with the modernist project and design, and in the one chapter, I talk about the fact that it's this notion of progress, better living through technology. And I talk about how again, the world fairs and world expositions became an important vehicle to promote this idea of industry and innovation, but also displaying the spoils, right? The spoils of colonial conquest. That there's also this amazing notion of like harmony among quote unquote eminent men. But then again, this is only referencing Europeans seeking to no longer be in conflict with one another, even though we know with the World War II that Europe again engaged with a deep and deadly conflict with one another. So the thing that comes out of this notion of again, giving up your national and ethnic identities in order to join a universal humankind is the fact that when this ideal moves through colonization to other places, it becomes the pretext in many ways for cultural genocide. And some of the aspects of that, like the hierarchy that gets established through this, where you have English at the top, and then you might have China and Asia in the middle, and then you have Africa and Latin America and all the other sort of colonized countries, sort of in this great chain of being. that actually still gets replicated today when you look at the way in which we evaluate design institutions. So if you look at the QS top university rankings for art and design, you will find European and Euro-American design schools at the top 10. The first Asian design schools only appear in the list in number 13, and others in the 20s and some in the 30s. Australian design schools appear in the 20s through the 40s. And then the first design school that's not European, Asian, or Australian is number 48, which is the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, UNAM. And so there's only 2 Middle Eastern schools and no African schools appear in the list of over 200 global design schools. Right. So again, this notion of design is tied into, and what is good design? There's a hierarchy that's been established in spite of this dialogue of let's all give up our identities in order to join universal humankind. Now, where that ideal succeeds is when it comes over through institutions, and it comes through institutions of colonization, where in the context of, let's say, becoming an American, you give up your Englishness, your Irishness, your Italianness in order to become universal humankind, functioning around a structure of white supremacy. And one of the most shocking things that I've learned probably in the last 5 years or so is that that the notion of white supremacy has a time and a place, right? Because I always assumed, like I say, most Black folks, that white people's racism was from time immemorial, but that's actually not true. That this notion of white supremacy, at least as described by Dr. Jacqueline Badalora, appeared only in document form in 1681, and the place where it took place was in Maryland. And so in her book, The Birth of the White Nation, The Invention of White People and Its Relevance Today, she talks about how through Maryland's anti-miscegenation laws and passing a series of kind of racist laws, that after a rebellion that brought together Black, freed as well as enslaved individuals, that brought together white and indentured servants under a system of like oppression from, white European planters and plantation owners or whatever, that bringing together of the two groups, that they set up a laws in Maryland to begin to separate, conquer and divide and conquer, Blacks from Indigenous, from white Europeans, by pushing down the social and economic and sort of justice, right, status of Blacks and Indigenous people. So all of a sudden, after these laws passed, white people couldn't marry a person of African descent or a person member of a native tribe. That you could not set enslaved African peoples free. So that free Blacks were prohibited from holding public office, that the beating and whipping of a white Christian servant naked without special order of the justice of the peace was prohibited. Persons of African descent could not testify against a white person. Free Blacks were not allowed to possess any weapons, nor could people of African descent or members of Native tribes vote? So through this structure of white supremacy, it pushed down, again, the social and economic status of Black and Native people so that the white indentured servants would see their alliances lie more with their white European oppressors, who now then they can aspire to in terms of having and building a better life for themselves. So this becomes important because we need to talk about white supremacy in two ways. We have to talk about it in the way in which it treats white bodies as fragile and needing of protection. So this becomes important in the context of, again, thinking about the way in which Black bodies, Indigenous bodies are harmed by, let's say, the police, because they are a threat. They are seen automatically as a threat to the fragility of the white body. We also need to see white supremacy as a cultural phenomena, and Joan and Akun, in the book, I talk about their notions of white supremacy culture and the kind of values that are there, and then the antidotes that they present to white supremacy. And here I want to just talk a little bit about, again, what this means for design. What this means for design is that many of the ways in which we create designs, if we're drawing from this Bauhaus perspective, which again is steeped in its own sort of white supremacy, that we are then in many ways excluding other bodies that are not white, male, abled body, in some cases, that are particularly, cis male. So there's an exclusion of sort of non-binary or other gendered bodies. And so when we go through the practice of, let's say, not finding a pair of eyeglasses that will fit my nose, or going into an environment where I can't find a hat that accommodates for my super curly, puffy hair, that these are all kinds of forms of microaggressions that say, my body doesn't belong here because the things that we design and the way in which we design them are not made for me. And so the work that's been done around universal design, the work that's been done by many inclusive design is in some ways the antidote to the way in which, again, this myth of let's get rid of all of our ethnic and national identities in order to become a, universal humankind, like that gets destroyed by the fact that the practices of design that live under white supremacy are by nature exclusionary, and that exclusion is by design. It is meant to tell people you don't belong. It's meant to tell you that the things that you make and create are craft and not design. It is meant to harm and make people feel irrelevant, and through the irrelevancy, make them available for exploitation. And so this is the way in which we have to understand that that we need to not just change the things that we design, but we have to actually change the underlying cultural values around what it is that we design. So for example, when we talk about better living through technology, it's normally this white supremacy values of like progress as being bigger and better. It's more about quantity over quality. There's a sense of like mechanized perfection in terms of trying to get all these corners, these square corners, and mechanized process. There is this notion, there's even this right to comfort, right? These are values, white supremacy values that are embedded in the way in which we think about modern design. And again, it's also this notion that, that this notion that when we're designing for the universal humankind, that is, again, a white body. And so if we are drawing from that mythology, if we're drawing from those values, then we're actually excluding the majority of the world. And so part of this particular chapter is trying to create that space in which other practices, whether it's for us or by us, FUBU, whether it's other ways of thinking and making, can be included, not in necessarily in a canon, just in an open field of like cultural biodiversity, so to speak, where these differences are there, present, recognized, and remunerated in proper ways. And they can all exist without this hierarchy, this great chain of being of hierarchy that's been established by our ideals of what is quote unquote modern design. And so there's many people that is doing the work, and a lot of what I try to bring in the book is like the roll call of everyone who I know who's doing this kind of work. But it's also, again, about reclamation and healing. So in the last part of the book, I talk about the work that we had done actually at Swinburne University when I was there, and I talk about the course that I taught. I taught, and then others taught, especially sort of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders began to teach in our fundamental design course, where we brought together Bauhaus principles of point, line, plane, rhythm and scale, framing and color, all of these sort of things, and we put them in dialogue with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander principles of respect, know, care, and share. And so Dr. Norm Sheehan, who was my colleague at the time, brought those Indigenous principles. And then I brought the sort of sense of the Bauhaus in the sense of not necessarily like the things they were trying to teach about, again, the fundamentals of the way in which we see the world through point, line, and plane, for example, that those things are actually valuable and very useful. And again, when we had Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander instructors, they were saying, I use these things, but I didn't know. And it was very useful because I can talk about the fact, like, why is it that they use dots, for example, in the desert areas, but here down in Victoria, we use lines as a way of expression in our gunite shields, right? So they were able to understand those principles, but where you find the reconciliation is that it's not based on this European values of modernism that is steeped in white supremacy, but you turn them around and you embed them in Indigenous principles where respect is, again, like, what's the trust that you are building between you and others? Knowledge, understanding that it comes directly from the experience of the land. Care, which is, again, how you ethically show ways of accountability and transparency. And then share, what is the opportunities in which you can connect with one another. And so by changing the underlying principles, by using Indigenous principles to shift the purpose of Bauhaus fundamentals of point, line, and plane, et cetera, you find that reconciliation between different ways of thinking and different ways of being to one that is not harmful, right? So that reconciliation seeks to make amends for the harm that was been done to, and in this case, Aboriginal ways of thinking and being, but still finds the value in those fundamentals of understanding how people view the world so that they can be shared with one another with a sense of generosity and without a sense of hierarchy. And so the practicality of the book is that I always end every aspect with some key takeaways. And so the key takeaways for dismantling the racist bias in the European modernist project is, first and foremost, white folks must do the work of healing their own intergenerational trauma because the work of decolonization is their work. And this I say all the time to my faculty members, is because when we were first undergoing this journey, especially like, again, my white males over the age of 45, were asking like, well, what is it that I can do? And it's like, you can do all the work. If you engage in a shift of these values, of your own values, away from these values of white supremacy, these cultural values of white supremacy, then if you do that work, that brings about the change. All the work that I'm doing is to try to convince you to change these values, to change the way in which you think and work, but you have to do the work. And the way in which you do the work is to first understand yourself and your own positionality, because in the process of colonization, people don't leave their homes because things are going well. They leave their homes out of desperation. And in that desperation, there is trauma. And the inability to deal with that trauma leads to that idea of, I need to protect at all costs this white body. I need to protect at all costs the values that I think I should have in order to protect this white body and white futures. And so by dealing with that trauma, healing with that trauma that comes from having to leave Europe, have that intergenerational trauma, you remove that view of the fragility of the body, and that every other body that is not this white European male Christian body is a threat that has to be eliminated. The second takeaway is that those of us who have been excluded from Modernist Design Project must continue to claim and reclaim our stories of making. And there's some really beautiful things that are happening in terms of that. So I think like Polymode's work in terms of like the Black history of graphic design, and they just had the Latinx history of graphic design. These are the People's Archive of Graphic Design. I'm probably not saying that, but there's a lot of great efforts that are being done now for, again, for us to be able to reclaim our traditions and histories of making, as well as innovate new ones. So we can have, again, this sense of diversity of practices and ways of approaching without a sense of hierarchy. And lastly, design firms and institutions, community organizations, and leaders need to cede space and power to Indigenous, Black, Asian, Latinx, Middle Eastern, and others originally framed as non-white, Christian, affluent, and since-male gender. The way in which transformation happens is that decolonization is about power, and the ceding of power, the ceding of privilege, right, which is one way of ceding power. That is the act that needs to happen in order to bring about cultural justice. And the way in which we can practice that is we can practice them in our firms and practice them in our institutions, so that then we have, in many ways, a way to think about how we practice that in our wider society, practice that in our politics, practice that in our education, in all these institutions, which again, because of these structures of white supremacy, have been quite harmful to Indigenous, Black, and other POC communities. So with that, I hope you've asked lots of questions, because I really, really would like to engage in a dialogue around some of the themes that I brought up.
That was wonderful, Dori. We do have some questions. I just want to encourage the audience again, if you go to the Q&A button, you can enter in your question and I will pose it on your behalf. So the first one is more of a comment than a question, as often happens at literary events. Hi, Dori, great point on the QS ranking. In addition, design institutions need to be willing to submit things to appear in the rankings. So that leaves a lot of institutions that could be more informal or craft-based out. You need money, you need attention to the standards, people dedicated to it, et cetera. Is there anything you want to comment on that comment?
Yeah, well, and for me, because again, I'm one of those people who get sent the thing. I think that the call just came out actually just this week to do the QS rankings of other institutions. And it's one of those things, like, again, I try to think of, I try to do that process very diligently to, in many ways, uncover the institutions that normally do not appear in the drop-down menu. At the same time, I always feel like, oh, why am I participating in this to begin with? Because it's already biased and not important. But I think, again, for there to be change, these institutions need to be seen. And as more diverse people get involved in these institutions, they can bring those experiences and lived experiences with those institutions to bear, to broaden, again, the ideal of what is a top-ranked university and what does it mean. And again, some of it is stacked because, again, the criteria is that, like, where do your students get jobs, right? And then, or what kind of research grants are they writing? And so there is a lot of bias in the assumption of what is good and what makes good. But it's also, again, important for us that are in these institutions to begin to challenge that notion, because what I talk about, like, how do we dismantle, right? So to be dismantling, in some ways, you have to dismantle within the institutions, at the same time, building these other institutions outside the institution. So there's alternatives for the ways in which people can practice and flourish.
All right, here's another question. How and where are discussions or critiques of white future workplaces taking place, giving the hyper focus on hybrid workplace and new design? How can we bring attention to the theoretical and practical ideas your book brings attention to in media, academic, and other discussions about the future of workers, workplaces, and their experiences? How do we unseat the power of corporations and other elite institutions? A lot of questions in that one question. I'll let you answer that as you see fit.
Well, first of all, if I had the answer to that question, I would probably be working at the UN trying to apply that learning. But I think how and where are discussions a critique of white futures happening? I mean, this is part of the reckoning that happened in 2020, and it's beginning to be pulled back because now everyone's like, oh, we're in a recession and we're going to fire everyone. But I know, right? I know that there are people who are still forcing these conversations within the institutions and trying to move things forward. And how do we unseat the power of corporations? Unfortunately, that, at least in North America, it requires that we vote differently, right? That we vote, because I always try to explain to some of my colleagues is that the difference between China and the United States, for example, is that in China, the government owns businesses. And then in the United States, the businesses own the government. And there's, and in both of those things, there's a lot of oppression and injustice that happens because of just the relationship between those systems. Mm-hmm. But it's a thing where, how do we unseat the power of corporations is that we have to, in many ways, lobby for greater accountability within the structures that we have and we've done it before. I mean, this is the thing that feels so sad, like when you read history, is that we've done it before. We've held them accountable, and it's just having the political will to continue to hold them accountable, which means giving up in some ways the sense of comfort that we might have while we think of our lifestyles as being great, giving up that comfort so that those who are the most vulnerable to the decisions of business, that their perspectives are brought to bear, and we make decisions to, again, remove their vulnerability. But the discussions are happening. And, part of my desire to move academia and move back into industry in this summer is helping to bring forward those conversations into industry in a much more expansive way.
Yeah. I think a related question to this, but very to the point, what do you see the role of capitalism being in upholding white supremacist delusion? Sort of related to what you just talked about, but also what you were talking about earlier.
Well, okay, so when you say that white supremacy took place in 1681 in Maryland, it was needed in order to uphold the capitalist system, because the threat that they saw of again, sort of, you had freed Blacks, you had enslaved Africans, you had indigenous communities and nations, and then you had European indentured servants. And the ideal for like the white European elite of those groups getting together to ruin the profit that they were making by the exploitation of their land and the exploitation of their labor, right? That's the capitalist system. That when they saw that threat, they're like, oh, we have to do something to change that. So, okay, if we convince these, again, white European indentured servants that their better life lies with partnering with us and betraying their colleagues, right? That they are in rebellion with, if we can convince them to do that, then there's more of us, white folks, who can then lead to greater oppression of all these other folks. And we need to oppress them so that, again, we can extract their labor, so that we can exploit and remove them from the land. So if you're pointing at like 1681 in Maryland, capitalism is the reason for upholding white supremacy. And that's why it's so difficult for us to remove that. Because again, there's still that group of, now they may not be indentured servants, but they're still tied to their work in ways that their lives are precarious, right? Yeah. And they use all kinds of cultural issues and wedges to convince them that they have greater alliance with, shall we say, Donald Trump, than they do the people that they may be working with every day at a factory or on a agricultural setting, or even, in an institution. So if we get, the only way, like, it's a thing where like everyone's like, oh, if we get rid of capitalism, will we get rid of white supremacy? No. If we got rid of white supremacy, guess what? We could probably get rid of capitalism, because it's that white supremacy that is upholding the desire to maintain those structures of exploitation.
That is such a clear answer to that question. Thank you. A couple of questions sort of about teaching and being a dean a little bit. How successful, how can institutions be successful in bringing BIPOC faculty to a design institution, and how does that affect how the decolonization of design education?
Yeah. Well, see, this is the part where I can talk directly about what's happening at OCAD University. So at OCAD University, we've had several cluster hires now. Our first cluster hire was in, I'm going to say 2017, 2018, where we brought in 5 Indigenous faculty members. Then our second cluster hire was the Black cluster hire, which brought in another 5 Black faculty members. We had our second Indigenous cluster hire, which brought in another 5 Indigenous faculty members just to the Faculty of Design. And then last year, we had a kind of BIPOC cluster where we basically brought in 4 or 5, either racialized, Indigenous, or Black candidates into the Faculty of Art. So
that's a ton of hiring.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's a thing where we are fortunate at OCAD that we've had a lot of retirements. So this is not like I've done like so much hiring since I've been at OCAD in the last 6 years. Like every year we're hiring 3 to 5 different people. But we still haven't had any net new hires, that they've all been sort of based on retirement. What that has meant, though, because they're based on retirements, is that it's been very easy for us to change the demographics, right? So we're pretty close, like we're pretty close to getting anywhere from 50 to 60% of full-time Black, Indigenous, and POC faculty within our full-time faculty complement. So there's a lot of things that we've done to be successful in doing that. What this has done is that we've been able to accelerate the decolonizing of our design education quite rapidly over the last 5 years. So, and some of the tangible ways of it is, for example, in the first year, you used to take art history pre-1800 and post-1800. Now, when you come in your first year, you get to choose one semester of either doing global art history, or you can do basically Indigenous art history. And so you don't actually encounter European design history, which then is called out as European design history. I mean, European art history. You don't encounter that until your second year. And that has been like the students, we've been doing that for the last 3 years now. And the students, again, can mark the difference because then they come in with either a global understanding, or they come in with a sense of like, I need to understand the making of Indigenous people that are here. So their whole framework of what is art is totally shifted, right? From what those who took the class, let's say 6 years ago, where they were told that this is art, this is European, these cathedrals in France, this is art, right? Yeah. Where now they're like, okay, this mosque in Timbuktu, that is art. Let's expose you to that first. So it can happen really quickly if you bring the people. And the beautiful thing that begins to happen when you bring visible diversity and you embrace visible diversity, 2 things have happened that have made me really, really happy. One is that those who have invisible differences are now coming out and saying, and they say explicitly, because we've created a space in which they feel that their differences would be understood and embraced. The second thing that happens that makes me super, 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 super happy is that people now feel that they can bring all of themselves into the institution in ways that allow the students to bring all of themselves into the institution. And that is actually, again, if we talk about decolonizing design means, again, dismantling these myths, just in that example of like the change in art history, we've already begun to dismantle the myth, right? In terms of putting Indigenous first, again, that's the same example. And we now have enough Indigenous faculty that our students are able to engage with Indigenous ways of knowing as the norm. That's the norm, right? And those are all leading to, again, this sense of decolonization that's happening throughout design education. And part of talking and writing the book, right, is being able to share this so that other institutions can move faster than even we did in the transformation.
Yeah. Sort of related question. Are you seeing more of the younger designers and students who are now going through this different program questioning sort of current or standard design processes and work? And are they becoming more interested in this idea of decolonizing design themselves through this exposure?
Yeah, the thing that our students are leading the decolonization of design is probably the best way to say it. They hold our faculty accountable. So a lot of things, you know, I'm the dean, so things kind of escalate to me after they've been through a couple of other things. And, you know, like a couple of things that come to me just to be aware of is that you have students speaking out saying, actually, this lecture that you're giving, we noticed that you didn't reference any Indigenous people, or you didn't reference any Black people, or you didn't reference any Asian people, and we expect we expect ourselves to be represented. And so they're holding the institution accountable. They're using our language of respectful design and decolonizing design to do that. And again, for us, it's enshrined in our academic and strategic plan. The thing that just happened this year is that it was part of our academic plan, from 2019. This year, as we redid it, is now part of our strategic plan, which means the administrative bodies are now held to the same accountability of decolonizing their processes as we have been in the design side and the art side and the liberal arts side of decolonizing our curriculum. And that's, to me, is that's where it's going to be fascinating, because it's actually a lot of these administrative governance processes that is, again, that's where the shifting of power really begins to happen when you change those.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Sure.
So if folks are interested in learning more, are there any resources or organizations you'd point them to beyond, of course, buying your excellent book, which everyone knows you do? But is there anywhere else, if someone's really turned on by this conversation, where should they look next if they want to learn more?
Oh my, okay. Seriously, I quote everyone in the book. It literally, there are entire paragraphs that's me just shouting out people that you should be following, you should look them up, you should understand them, et cetera, et cetera. But other places, let's say that some of the areas that I do mention that I'm really excited about. I'm really excited about the work that's being done around Indigenous artificial intelligence. And if you just if you just literally Google Indigenous artificial intelligence, a bunch of stuff will come up. I'm really fascinated. Again, I mentioned before the work that's being done by Polymode in terms of the histories of, broader histories of design education. There's a bunch of new books that have come out in terms of Black, brown perspectives on design. I mean, there's so much stuff that's in there. Literally, if you put diversity and design books, you would come up with hundreds and hundreds of references, because everyone's been busy these last 2 years preparing the books to really explain these positions. And again, the publishing industry has opened up to allow these perspectives to be brought to the fore.
Well, everyone here in the audience and readers around the world are so lucky that you put pen to paper for this book and that it's out now and people can read it, because I think it sounds like it's really going to change things. So I just want to once again say thank you, Dori, for spending your evening with us and sharing all this information. And thank you to everyone out there in the virtual world, from around the world, for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about and purchase Decolonizing Design at harvard.com or via the link in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and please be well. Thank you so much.